One of the quickest ways to automatically color blend two layers together in Photoshop is to select the layer that's on top, go to Image, Adjustments, Match Color, and you'll see down the bottom here we have Image Statistics. I can choose the source, which is Untitled 1, the current document, and the layer, which is, I've got Wizard and Background. I go to Layer, Background, and it will automatically adjust that image. Now at the moment, that doesn't look very good, but I can adjust some settings until it looks its best. I'm going to hit Neutralize to see what it does, and I'm going to just fade. The luminance will bring the brightness up. Color intensity will demonstrate how much it affects the image. And of course, I can fade that so it's completely off to the original color, or 100% at like a really crazy level. So after adjusting and finding it, I can now click OK. And if I go back and forth, you'll see it goes from blue. You can see how it has automatically adjusted that to the image. Now, while we're talking about blending objects in, just remember that you need to be aware of the environment. Now, you will notice that he's actually standing on water, so there is no reflection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer, move it underneath. I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, Flip Vertical, and then move it down. Now, it doesn't quite meet up, so I'm going to hit Control-T for Free Transform. And I'm just going to zoom out. If I hold down Control, I can kind of skew that up a little bit. And now we have a solid reflection that if I bring the opacity down a little bit, looks a little bit more natural. Another thing I can do is introduce an element at the front. So I've typed in smoke here at pexels.com. I scroll down, find something basic that's on a black and white background like this. And I can download that image, import it into Photoshop, and then I can actually just add a screen overlay to create a little bit of mist that sits in front of our wizard. So adding a little bit of an environmental element in front of objects can definitely help. And then I can blend by adding a mask to this layer and just removing some of that so we get that nice element in front. And those are a few simple approaches to blending objects in layers in Photoshop. So let's say I have this cyberpunk background, a lot of blue, some pinks, and I want to actually blend this dinosaur into it. Again, if you want to learn how to cut out objects, there's a link in the description below, but I'll also pop a card at the end of this video showing you various ways to cut out objects. I'm going to cut out this dinosaur by going to Select Subject, and I'm going to mask that layer. I'm also, for good measure, going to duplicate that layer, turn this one off, and convert this one to a smart object. And from here, I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and Color Balance. And from here, because he's a very warm tone up against a very cool tone, I can slide these back and forth until I feel it blends a bit better. I can move these so the magenta is probably a bit more accurate. Blue or yellow. Yellow is a warmer color, which makes it stand out. When I bring it back towards the blue, it tends to blend a bit better. I can move this back and forward. And I can also change this by choosing to manipulate the shadows. So make that a bit more blue if I want to. Go to midtones, make more adjustments, and even the highlights. I can make the highlights bluer. So you can make little adjustments to try and blend those colors in by changing these back and forth between yellow and blue, green and magenta, blue and red, and then also change this here. You can turn this one on or off, but I prefer just to leave it on and click OK. Now our dinosaur is looking like he's actually in the scene. However, we still don't have the best lighting we could have. Now very quickly, I've noticed these teeth aren't cut out very well, so I'm going to very quickly correct that. And in order to blend this more effectively, we do need to start actually using our brushes and tools like a digital artist. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call it Blue Glow. I'm going to hold down Alt above this layer so it clips to that layer, which means anything I paint will only appear over the dinosaur, but not over the background. And the way it works, I'm going to choose a color. I'm going to try and pick the blue color here. I'm going to go for the strong, maybe even make it a little bit more blue so that way it matches this side of the light a little bit. I grab my brush layer and I make sure I have it hardness to 0, so we've got a nice soft layer. Bring that size sort of down a bit, not too high, and we're going to draw a bit of blue on this left side, keeping in mind that wherever there would be a shadow, we don't want blue in there. So I might draw this way, but we're going to remove some around the mouth soon. Get our eraser. Again, keep it nice and soft. Just kind of remove around the mouth where we don't think the blue would appear. And then our layer blend, we're going to put that to, we can try color dodge, linear dodge, or lighter color, whichever you think achieves the best results. The fill will need to come down a little bit, and you're going to need to make some more adjustments just to make sure it looks the way you want it to. Just use the eraser to get rid of some of that. And then again, we add another layer, hold down Alt again. I'm going to call this one Pink Glow. And I'm going to actually switch these over so I can keep this blue there. And I'm going to select this pink over here. And we do the same process on the right where the pink is coming from. Again, I'm going to use my eraser just to dial it back a little bit. And I'm going to go for color dodge and then adjust that down. And now our image has the correct kind of light color on one side, which is pink on the right, blue on the left, and it looks a little bit more naturally lit. Now this was a bit quick, so you can spend a bit more time if you want to get really detailed with it, but that's another way of trying to blend in your images. So I've got this image where we pop this guy on the scene, and you'll notice the background is actually, the darker areas are actually quite light. But this guy here is like a full black, and the color doesn't really match. So one thing we can do is I have this as a smart object. I can go to Image, Adjustment, and Curves. And I can try and adjust the dark area down the bottom here up, since it's black on the grid, and try and match that lightness and then try and color correct, but it's a little bit of a long-winded process, so I'm going to cancel. It's possible, but longer than it needs to be. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go down the bottom here and create an adjustment layer. I'm going to go Curves, and before I adjust this, I'm going to hit Alt and actually just clip it to this layer here. I double click on this again to get my curves back. Now what I want to do is head up to this little icon here and go to Auto Options. And you'll notice here it says Enhance Brightness and Contrast. Instead, what I want to do is find the dark and light colors. When I click on Shadows, I can pick the darkest area of the image, which is here. And you can see already it started to correct the darkness of that image. The midtones are still gray, but I think the midtones tend to be more of a brown color. So I click on midtones, find what I think is about the mid area of the image and click it. And you can see it's actually a bit high. It should be about centered. So I'm just going to bring it down a bit. And I can make manual adjustments and click OK. I'm going to click OK again. And I am not going to set this as default because I don't want it to be set on this image. And you can see now how our guy is actually now blended into the scene. But another way you can do this is instead to go back. So I'm going to hit Control Z a few times. And we're back to our original image. We actually go to the background layer and then go to Image, Adjustment, Curves, and just darken it up. I can see from this graph here where the actual image darkness starts, so I can just simply drag that across and actually just adjust the image to match. I can then do my color balance here, as we did before. And because we've got a lot of yellow, I'm going to make the highlights more yellow. And go shadows, make the shadows a bit more blue or cyan. Looks like there might be a little bit more magenta actually. And now the color does match a bit better again. But there's one issue when it comes to blending is we now have to start looking at light and understanding how that works. So again, now this image is still not quite perfect, but I feel like we can definitely make it a bit better. So I've got him here. I'm going to control click on the layer. Go to Quick Mask over here. And we're going to create a shadow from this. And the way that works is, first of all, I'm going to hit Control T for free transform. And I'm going to hold down Shift so that I can just move this down, flip it to there. Now, if you don't have the link turned on between the width and the height, you may not need to hold down Shift. I'm going to just bring it up here. And then I'm going to hold down Control and just drag these points out because these shadows are coming out at an angle. So I want him to be casting a shadow at an angle. I zoom in to make sure it's meeting the feet nicely. I hit Enter. So I'm going to exit my Quick Mask. I'm going to add a new layer, but I'm going to add that layer, move it underneath. And then I'm just going to pick my shadow color. It could be by picking here somewhere. It'll match the shadow of the street then. Okay. And then I get my bucket and I fill that in. And now I deselect by hitting Control D, but the shadow is still just a bit too solid, and also the edges are a bit too sharp. So now we're going to go to Filter, Blur Gallery, and Field Blur. because I can add a wheel at the start to blur it slightly. And I go right down to the bottom and I crank this up to really blur that out. And I can also adjust in the center if I want to as well. I click OK. And now our blur looks pretty legit. And what I can do is simply go up here to normal. I can go to multiply, color burn. I can choose which one I think looks best. Darker color doesn't look too bad, but it does hide some of that element. So I'm going to go to multiply, but then I'm going to bring that fill down, although we're still not getting the result we want. So I'm going to come back up, put it on normal, because that doesn't look too bad. But instead, I'm going to double click on our layer, and you might need to use your best judgment here. But where it says blend if under blending options, I'm going to take the underlying layer, and where that reflection is there, if I bring this back, I can slowly have that reappear. And what I'm going to do is hold down Alt to separate those two markers and just bring this back, bring that forward, and I can adjust that until I think it looks best, and then I click OK. I'm going to bring that fill down a tiny bit so it looks a little bit natural. And now our man has a shadow here, which is a little bit more convincing. So that's how you can create shadows with selections pretty easily. And of course, he is still a little bit dark, so I'm going to select him and go to Image, Adjustments, Curves, and I can bring that lightness up a little bit. Now we have our character and he's casting a shadow, which looks pretty good. Now talking about blending light, he does have a strong light source behind him as well. So I would intend, in most cases, you might have seen this in a previous video, add another layer, grab white, get a nice big brush, not too hard, get the hardness down, and just introduce a bit of white around those edges. And that just makes him look a little bit more naturally put into the scene. And just to add an extra element to it, even though the sun wouldn't actually be shining directly onto the sword, adding a little bit of highlight to the blade by doing something like this with a white brush and adjusting with your eraser, adding a color dodge again. Color dodge I tend to use a lot. You can get a nice reflection on that blade too, which kind of just helps add it to the scene. And again, we can add another layer yet again and get a nice glow there on that blade and bring that fill down. And that looks a little bit more natural. The final thing I'd like to do for images like this, before I get into one of my personal techniques, is I actually like to add a color lookup over the whole image. So I'm going to simply go down the bottom here to adjustment layers, add a color lookup. And before you do this, make sure you have the very top layer selected in your layers palette, and we can choose a LUT. And what that does is adds a filter over the entire image, which will help to blend those colors in. There's a whole bunch here. The bleach bypass is a bit full on, but we can go through and see which ones we think look best. This one does have a good effect, the way it sucks some of the blue out of the image. However, I don't want it to be full strength, so I can bring the fill down to about 50 or even 40%. And if I turn that on or off, you'll see the difference. It sort of blends in a little bit more naturally. And this is our final image, which blends together pretty well, and the light seems to just really connect with the subject, and everything just seems to flow naturally. Okay, so this is actually a technique I usually like to use a fair bit. I've got this robot here in this background. The first thing I need to do is I do need to blend that color in, so I will just very quickly do that. So now the colors match, but he kind of gets lost in the scene a little bit, and the lighting doesn't necessarily look like it really matches up. So a few things I like to do. The first thing I like to do is use some form of element to break things up. As I mentioned before, I can pop some smoke in there, but in this instance, what I might do is add in a little bit of fire just to kind of break it up further. So let's say I pop a fire image here, which I also downloaded from Pexels. And I'm gonna just sit that here, just in front of him a little bit. And I'm gonna put it on screen since it has a black background, and we got some flames there. But then we also add some flames in the background to help break it up further. So I'm gonna grab this image, pop it in there. Has a fireman in it. I'm gonna just flip it over. Again, I put it on screen. Now we've got some fire in front. I'll pop it behind him this time. So we've got a little bit of fire behind him. and just some subtle flames in front. Now there is one image in particular I like, and this is another way you can really bring some elements into it that blend things together, is I have a fire image here, and it has all these little embers and dots and bits and pieces in there, and by adding those in a subtle way, now the image background isn't entirely black, so I'm going to go to Image, Adjustment, and Curves to really blacken that background. I make that screen or whatever layer blend works best, and I add in that element. It sits just in front of him, but doesn't necessarily interfere with what he's doing. And now we look like we have this image with a bit of fire in it. It doesn't have to be fire. It can be as simple as light or mist. If I do remove the fire, simply adding in a little bit of mist in the background, even with just your white brush, like this, bringing that back. Doesn't have to be anything fancy, just that brush there, and then you can add another layer on top, clip it to that, and then do the same again, but just turn it down. So you can do things like that just to break it up a bit as well. But let's go back to the flames, because we've got a bit of orange smoke in there. We've added some elements to help bring that together. But it's still getting lost. And there's something I really like to do with my images, and this works really well with fantasy type images or sci-fi images. It can be a bit hit and miss when you're including actual people, is I like to actually draw in a lot of light and shadow onto my images. So the way that works is I might go down to my background layer here. I create a new layer above that one. I grab my brush tool and I kind of just create some edges. And this acts as a way of kind of lighting the edge. It looks a bit crazy at the moment, but I draw these edges. I'm going to pretend I've got a light source coming from up here somewhere, and it actually provides a bit of separation between the objects. So this is the light, and then we move on to the shadow. I'm going to quickly speed ahead. So I've drawn some basic outlines on the building. I grab my eraser and I make some adjustments to where I think it might just fade off a little bit. I then go to Filter, Blur, and then I Gaussian blur that light source a little bit to give it a little bit of a glow, and so it doesn't have to be as precise. And what I typically do is I choose one of these lighten blends like color dodge, linear dodge. Typically color dodge does a pretty good job, and I'll just tone it back a bit. And it has a way of kind of lighting up those buildings in a subtle way. And then I go ahead and add shadow. So I go back, and this time I duplicate the layer, and I'm going to go to Image, Adjustment, Curves, and I'm going to bring the light down a fair bit, make it darker. I'm then going to create a negative mask by holding Alt, clicking the mask tool, and I get a blank mask. So I click in here and I grab my paintbrush tool with the white, and then nice big brush, and I paint in areas of shadow. Adjustments get made with the eraser. So now if I turn those layers off, you'll see things are flat, and then we've got a little bit more dimension added in there. Just adds a little bit of a glow. And now we take that exact same process, move up, and apply it to our robot in order to enhance the light and shadow on him. I get a little bit more precise with the foreground object. So now I've created some pretty strong light on the side here. So I'm going to go Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur again, color dodge, and just tone that layer fill down until I feel it looks pretty good. And I've created a bit of light on the right, but I really need to create a shadow in order for him to stand out. So again, but this time there's an issue because I have already masked this layer. I'm going to control click on the mask, hit copy on that layer, and then paste. And now that is masked in between the two of them. I can do the same as before and go to Adjustments and Curves, bring it all down, and then I create my negative mask by holding Alt and hitting the mask button. I then click on the mask, and as we did before, I introduce the areas where I think the shadows will show up the most. This is a little bit dark, so I bring that layer of opacity down. And again, if I turn those two off, we get something that's reasonably flat. Now we have something a little more three-dimensional, and our character's starting to blend in just a bit more. Now finally, if you do have other light sources in here, for example, the eyes are glowing, I think that's pretty much taken care of itself, but we have got fire, which would be lighting up this robot a little bit. So again, we want to add another layer for the fire, and I'm going to make that one color dodge again, but this time I'm going to choose maybe an orange somewhere in between. And I paint in. You can see we've got that glow there. It's a little bit extreme, but for now we're going to stick with that and just try and highlight areas we think the flames would actually light up. Looking for the sides of paneling and things like that. Once again, adjust with our eraser to sort of fade it in a bit. Now that's pretty full on. I'll adjust that face a bit. And again, we just bring that fill down. And things are lit up a little bit better. So that is the final image. So you see how the image on the left we've got is pretty flat, and the image on the right has a little bit more dynamic, and looks a little bit more artistic, and has a bit more energy to it. But that is a personal preference and not one I necessarily think you have to learn. It's not a fundamental, just something I like to play with. And as I go along, I'll try and teach you more of this stuff. But for now, I hope that's given you some ideas and things to play with in Photoshop while blending your images together. So if you liked the video, please consider giving it a like. Try this stuff out for yourself, and please don't be afraid to share any of the images you have with me on Twitter or tag me on Instagram. I'd love to see your work and go from there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.